Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Great to have you with us. And as I was telling our guests tonight, I got a couple of special guests. My parents are in town from Chicago, so things are getting back to normal. They made COVID parole. They flew in. They're going to be watching over my shoulder. So if I seem distracted, I'm trying to be a good son. So do me a favor, lie and tell them I'm a great employee and I'm good at my job. Just cover for me. Before we get started tonight, a couple things. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Cape Cod 5, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And all books are available at the Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. Our guest tonight, Richard Bell, is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. His research focuses on the history and culture of the United States between 1750 and 1877. So are you joining us from College Park? All right. So would you welcome our guest tonight, Richard Bell?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And I've heard Mark is a great employee and very good at his job, just so we're all clear on that point. It is wonderful.
The check is in the mail.
To be with all of you tonight. I hope you're happy and healthy wherever you are. I know temperatures in Massachusetts have been very summery indeed these last few days. I'm hugely impressed by the roster of books and authors that Mark has coming through over the next couple of weeks. I hope you come back for as many of those as you can. I'm going to come back for Linda Colley, who's a rock star, talking about her new book, The Gun, the Pen, the Ship, and my friend Jonathan Wells talking about the Kidnapping Club. Do look out for those. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. So I'm a professor of history, as Mark said, at the University of Maryland in College Park. I'm just outside College Park, Maryland right now, where it's also a beautiful summer's evening, though we have the cicadas that everyone's been talking about, the 17-year cicadas. So if I opened my window, it would sound like a car alarm's going off, and it's not a car alarm. It's the cicadas. So let me talk today for about 30 minutes about the subjects, characters, and themes of my recent book, Stolen, which, as you may know from the description you've seen, or if you've ever seen the cover, this is about very serious stuff. So let me get started right away. And then with any luck, I will take some questions and comments when we get through in about 30 minutes. So I say sobering because Cornelius Sinclair was just 10 years old, and yet he was trapped. He was stuck, he was locked in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like this one, that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philly's Market an hour ago, shoved a black gag across his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him aboard this little ship. And it was dark below its waterline. But Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down there. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him. 4 other African-American boys. One looked about his size. He was maybe 10 or 11 like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was shorter and smaller than the rest, and he might have been as young as 8 years old. And yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were enslaved. They were prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners down in the deep, deep South. And if their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared from Philadelphia in late August 1825, one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, the city of Philadelphia was actually the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Its gridded streets and its tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews. Oh, we're going to mute some people up, Mark, who've left their mics on. There we go. Philadelphia's gridded streets and tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. And those kidnappers did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time, not only as the city of brotherly love, but also as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of the American anti-slavery movement. But of course, to criminals, to kidnappers, none of that stuff mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And that was a product of its location. It was the nearest major free city on the East Coast to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, including Delaware and Maryland. I'm sitting in Maryland right now. And of course, Virginia. And as Pennsylvania and other northern states, including Massachusetts, had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary line had become ever more important, especially for African Americans. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, that Mason-Dixon line seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free soil states from the southern slave states. And Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made its many free black residents very attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states. They preyed on the members of the city's free black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs and prices on their heads. And the people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi, three of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. And the American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton, and they would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Now, buying a small percentage of their black laborers from kidnappers of free people was not likely their first choice, but their options were circumscribed. Planters down there in the Deep South have been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808, the year that lawmakers in Washington, D.C., about 10 miles from where I'm sitting, had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them in the United States. That 1808 decision is not particularly famous, unless you're an historian, but it was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America, a turning point that would spur the growth thereafter of an American internal domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the US tried to satisfy these Southwestern settlers' demands for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia that were in surplus and where there were planters willing to sell. And that was all legal. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more than that. And the stronger their demand, the more tempting and more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children like Cornelius from northern cities like Philadelphia, and then launder them into that legal supply chain in the slave states and sell them in that vast new southwestern slave market. Those economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free Black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of an inter-regional kidnapping operation. It had become a terminus of something, the northern terminus, the northern point of origin of something I call America's reverse underground railroad. So when I say those words tonight, America's reverse underground railroad, I'm referring to what I've just described, the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free African Americans, usually from northern towns and cities. And this reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they of course ran in opposite directions, right? And they existed for completely different purposes. But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirrors of one another. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people abandoned southern plantations and trekked usually northward, dreaming of new lives, new opportunities in freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free Black people were stolen from northern cities like Philly and made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their lives and their own liberty to help Black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. While on America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated only by money. Both of these networks, one obviously heroic, one obviously monstrous, roared to life in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North and in the South. Both networks, one good, one bad, were loosely organized and opportunistic. They both ran on secrecy. They both relied on small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, false identities, and disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and victims of kidnapping made to go south were largely the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And if that was not enough, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of Black adults and children across state lines, half of them towards freedom, half of them towards slavery. Most Americans, I hope, and despite this accent, I'm a proud US citizen, most Americans know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad, the good one. Historians have spent, after all, decades studying the strategies and tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. Their achievements now command our attention, and there are walking tours about the Underground Railroad, movies, television shows, and this new movie, Harriet, which came out before the pandemic, and this brand new series on Amazon Prime. All of them dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom. But I think we know far less about what I'm calling tonight America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable, and the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even today. These kidnappers certainly never gave public lectures about their work. They never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names and their crimes even appear in surviving police files or trial transcripts. That low profile, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes and corruption, and far too much indifference and apathy among ordinary Americans who knew exactly what they were doing. Unlike legal interstate slave traders who sometimes donated their papers to Southern colleges and historical societies, the outlaws who built America's reverse Underground Railroad left no business records, no bundles of private letters for historians like me to find in the Library of Congress. Kidnappers don't write memoirs. They don't pose for paintings or photographs, leaving journalists and activists at the time to guess, as you see here, as to what they might have looked like. You're looking at a guess. But, as I argue in my new book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story told in my book begins, but about every northern town or city with a free Black population, including many places in Massachusetts, if we think not just about 1825, when this true story in Stolen begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free people, many of them children like Cornelius, who were under the age of 16. And let me be very clear, most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched frantically. They lobbied and petitioned and advertised desperately. They waited in earnest for news, but usually nothing came. Free Black people in northern cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia had few white allies in this period of American history, beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. And what's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, and city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints, turned a blind eye to most white-on-black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates or policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants or search property or interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews knew exactly what to do, exactly what to say, to talk their way out of trouble and to get back to work. I'm guessing all of you watching tonight have heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northup, who of course was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Northup later escaped his enslavement. It took him 12 years to do it, but he did it. He returned home, and then he wrote about it. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he wrote in 1853, Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed white conmen lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Northup was a well-educated, prosperous musician, literate and fully employed, in his mid-30s. And in Manhattan, they wined him and dined him. And if you remember the movie, you know they drugged him too. And then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C., not too far from where I am. And then he found himself boarded on a slave ship that was bound for New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his sugarcane fields for 12 years. In 2013, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew, I think, overdue attention to Northup's ordeal. But both the memoir and that important Oscar-winning film offer, nonetheless, I think, distorted, maybe even misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted, and how those agents usually made their money. Because, folks, it turns out that Northup's experience on America's reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. Kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Solomon Northup. No, they preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with ruses that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on their own 2 feet. Their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. Their prisoners were vastly more likely to be sold off in ones and twos along the way, in furtive, all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more slaves, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my book, Stolen. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe, 5 boys, fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto that little ship I mentioned, just outside Philadelphia, which is in the top right of this map. Their captors warehoused them for a couple of weeks in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland border, just above the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen. And then after a week or two there, the kidnappers marched them onwards, halfway across this vast continent, toward the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 free children as slaves. This, of course, was a soul-destroying journey. On your own 2 feet as a child, it's a journey of 2 million steps. In the interest of time tonight, I'm going to pass over it, though I have a lot to say about it in the book. Likewise, at my publisher's request, I have to pass over much of the book's second half, in which readers learn that some, but not all, of these 5 boys make a miraculous escape and begin the astonishing odyssey home to Philadelphia, referred to in the book's subtitle. All I'll say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen in the second half of this true story was indeed astonishing to them and to me 200 years later, because it would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the earth, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far, a manhunt which much of it takes place in Massachusetts, believe it or not. So I'm not allowed to spill all the beans. I'm proud of this book. We want you to take a look at it. But instead of telling you everything that happens, let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next has never before been told. And for obvious reasons. Cornelius was a child at the time. He came from a hard-up family that was not the sort to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that's a problem, right? Because this is a true story, it's history. And historians need sources, lots and lots of sources, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are fair and true. And the stories and the struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers and diaries and memoirs often remain untold and unstudied as a result of the lack of readily available sources. So to reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from this guy, the mayor of Philadelphia, a man who belatedly, almost too late, wades into this story. And I turned first to coverage of Cornelius's kidnapping in a single anti-slavery magazine. And to be clear, historians have known about these modest sources for some time, but on their own, they turn out to be too few and too thin to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing odyssey into and out of slavery. So of course, I had to go looking elsewhere, digging around in any archive I could find for scraps of information that when put together could help flesh all of this out. And along the way, there have been a lot of days spent finding nothing at all, looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only hay. Ultimately, though, it's definitely been worth it. Over 6 years of research for this book, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles in those haystacks, new sources about this case, buried within 35 archives in 14 states. And again, Massachusetts and Boston loom surprisingly large. I'm not going to tell you all the new sources, that would take me a long time. Let me just mention 3. I found, for instance, the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial which would decide the fate of one of these boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered something I thought I would never find. I discovered a pair of letters in which one of these kidnappers names his accomplices and describes their roles in this case. Extraordinary find. I copied it out in the back of my book so you can read it for yourself. It's astonishing. But most affectingly of all, at least to me, was this missing persons notice put in a Philadelphia paper by Cornelius's grieving, frantic father 2 days after his son disappeared. Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy, about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause, and never before absented himself, it is feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad, pretty stout-built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair. All of us are born to parents. Many of us are parents of children or grandchildren. I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old in the next room playing with their mother. The thought that my children could be taken from me like this, and there'd be nothing I could do but this ad. It just rips at me, it tears at me in a very primal, basic way. Afflicted parents, Joseph says, afflicted parents. To me, that reads like the understatement of the 19th century. Okay, before I see if there's any comments or questions, let me very quickly now wrap up with a couple of brief reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free children ripped from their families, swallowed up by American slavery, is worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities from Boston to Philadelphia, and Black freedom was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I said, I'm not allowed to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half, or even tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. But I will drop a few big hints. And I will say that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save him and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize free Black communities across the northern states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists like the 2 white women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet to try to focus the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families forcibly separated by kidnappers and by slave catchers and by slave traders and by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And this 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage kidnappers and slaveholders and Southerners more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. And it set in motion a chain of court challenges and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination that put this country on a collision course with civil war. So to conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him and the things that he and the other boys made happen next would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy must not be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery in 1825. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. Thanks very much, everyone. On this final slide, I've got the usual information about where you can find the book. The most important thing to know is you can find it at your local independent bookstore, Eight Cousins in Falmouth. It's also available in all the usual other places like libraries and on Audible, audiobook, Kindle, etc. And if anyone has a desperate urge for a signed copy with my signature scrawled in it, you can send me an email at the address below, and we can figure that out easily. Mark, how do you want to handle comments and questions?
Well, I know that my veteran viewers know that if they got a question, you can use a chat feature down below, and I'll start. First of all, thank you. That was unbelievable, and it probably took a parent to write this book and give it the proper gravitas, because I think that I think that it needs that touch. How long did it take you to research this, knowing that as you said, there were a whole lot of haystacks to look at and not many needles? How long did it take you to do this, and what did you ever just say, I just can't pull this off? I mean, how were you able to pull this off?
Well, thank you for the question, Mark, and I do welcome other comments and questions. I do take to the chat so Mark can read some things out there. We can have a human interaction here on Zoom. So this was the hardest thing I've ever done. This is my third book, and this was the hardest thing I've ever done, for all the reasons that I discussed in the talk, and then some, right? The reasons I discussed in the talk are that reconstructing criminal activity by people who tried not to leave traces behind them and who chose children, most of whom were illiterate, as their victims, is definitely a challenge for any historian. So it took me a long time, probably 10 years of my life from start to finish, Mark, including 6 years of research before I started writing. And I will tell you that in the course of that decade, I not only became a father twice over. My daughters are 7 and 4, so you can do the math there. But also the shape of this project changed. I stumbled upon this project via one of the kidnappers, a woman who features prominently in the book. Her name is Patty Cannon. She's in her mid-60s in 1825, and she's the co-leader. She's a white lady, the co-leader of this fearsome and very well-known gang of kidnappers, famous enough that they were in the papers regularly, famous enough that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman had probably heard the name, Patty Cannon, by the way. But I came across this particular story by coming across her, and my initial thought was that, oh, I'm going to write a biography of this dreadful woman as a way to shine a spotlight on this phenomenon of the kidnapping of free African-American adults and children. And, even just a few months into that project, Mark, I realized that for my own mental health, I did not want to spend the next 10 years inside the brain or looking at the soul of this kidnapper. So the book shifted over time and became focused on one particular kidnapping that she had been responsible for, the kidnapping of these 5 boys over about 24 hours in 1825. And I worked very hard to make sure that these boys are the central actors in my story. Things are done to them, but then by God, do they make things happen themselves as this story unfolds. So I try to see the world through the eyes of these boys. I try to live this story on their shoulders. And my God, they've taught me a lot about resilience and courage in the course of this. I'm so glad and honored to spend the last 10 years of my life in their company and not solely in the company of Patty Cannon and her fellow kidnappers.
The kidnappers and the kidnapping gang were well known, as you said. And Philadelphia is the headquarters of the abolitionist movement and the free slave. Are these forces coming together? Are there other people rising up to say, this is an abomination, we've got to stop this? Or is this just kind of like, oh, well, and a lot of shrugs?
Yeah, so I think no one's really put this together, Mark, in the way you just did. But I think one of the reasons why Philadelphia is, for a period, the center of the American anti-slavery movement is because of all the abominable stuff which is happening on the streets, right? So you could make the argument that Philadelphia's anti-slavery bona fides among at least white Quakers, which is a very small group of people, are born out of what they see on the streets. That's a really useful thing to say. So we can say that we can say that the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, known among historians as the PAS, is the first anti-slavery society in America, founded in about 1775. It will lead to copycat organizations in New York and Boston and other places, and eventually a national organization run by the likes of William Lloyd Garrison from Boston, Massachusetts. But in the 1820s, there is no national organization. There's only state-level stuff, and Philadelphia leads the way. It's ironic, however, to consider the limits of white-led anti-slavery activism. The PAS, for all its seriousness about fighting injustice and looking after Black freedoms, such as they are in this period, is a whites-only organization. Black people are not allowed to join. And of course, if they want to actually help, they need the cooperation and camaraderie of the free Black community in Philadelphia. They need to be trusted by members of the free Black community. And building that trust is a decades-long project. And one of the stories told in this book is about how members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society are forced to focus on the epidemic of kidnapping of free Black adults and children by often the parents of those children. When Cornelius goes missing, his dad doesn't just sit on his hands. He doesn't just place that ad, in fact. He actually, goes to the nearest Quaker lawyer he can find and demands that the Quaker lawyer leave his Sunday dinner, push back his chair, follow him down to the docks, and do something. So without that practical activism by members of the free Black community, then Quakers wouldn't have much to do. So it's a real coalition building moment to deal with this scourge. But in the general population, Mark, there's a lot of apathy, unfortunately, as well.
All right, you mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. Our friend David Garrison asked, when The Liberator is being published in Boston, did they report on this? And if so, were you, if there's articles in it, were you able to access those and use that for your own research?
So yes and yes. Now, I'm very curious as to whether David Garrison is related to William Lloyd Garrison. I think there are some descendants of the Garrison family that I've come across in my time, but the short
answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Amazing. Amazing. So congratulations on having a wonderful ancestor you can be very proud of. That's awesome. So William Lloyd Garrison, who is the founder of the national organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1831, 1833, somewhere around there. The Liberator is his newspaper. It's the first sort of national anti-slavery newspaper headquartered in Boston. Does, yes, write about kidnapping repeatedly. Not this case, because this case is 6 years before the Liberator is founded in 1831. The case is from 1825. But I want to be super clear. This case is not special. It's not unique. It's one of hundreds, thousands of cases like it. And Garrison is well aware that this is an epidemic. And it's also worth saying that Garrison was trained in Baltimore, working under a guy called Benjamin Lundy on a previous paper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And that paper is chock-a-block with these kidnapping stories. And Lundy and The Genius covered this particular case in some detail. So there's a direct connection to Garrison, one of the great men of American history.
Are these kidnapping gangs ever broken, uncovered? I mean, what becomes of them, or do they carry on throughout the war, through the Civil War?
Yeah, great question. So I can't give short answers, but I will really try, David. Mark, excuse me. It depends. Sometimes some operatives are arrested and tried and convicted. Sometimes they're arrested and let go. Sometimes they slip through the fingers of law enforcement. Many more times, law enforcement doesn't really take a strong interest in seeking justice. Remember, these are very racially segregated and racialized societies. Just because slavery is dead in Philadelphia does not mean that racism is dead in Philadelphia. And that extends to elected officials, it extends to the civilian population, it extends to law enforcement as well. So enforcement of anti-kidnapping laws is very intermittent. This story is made possible to the extent this book has a happy ending, Mark. It's because some figures in law enforcement buck the trend I just described and do something substantial in this particular case. But as you'll hear from Jonathan Wells when he comes to talk to you in a couple of weeks, he's the author of a new book called The Kidnapping Club, which is about this epidemic as it plays out in New York City in the 1850s. And I think what John would tell you is this epidemic continues all the way up until the Civil War. As long as there is slavery, there are people willing to kidnap free Black people and sell them as slaves across America.
I know they made the movie 12 Years a Slave, but please tell me somebody's approached you about making this into putting it on film and putting it on cinema. Please tell me that's happening.
I hope that is going to happen. Yeah, my agent is very excited every time we get a nibble from someone with a California zip code. So we hope that's going to happen. People do need to see this story, and not everyone is as interested in reading books as you and I. So sometimes the TV shows, the movies are the best way to reach people with important true stories. As this Amazon Prime version of the novel Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead is reminding us, there is demand for important stories about African-American history, and too often we underestimate the public's appetite and interest in those important stories. For what it's worth, there's an audiobook of this book. I'm not the narrator because I have a weird British accent, and my press correctly concluded that having an American accented person read this book on the audiobook would be a smart choice. But if you like audiobooks, I really recommend this one. The guy, whose name is Leon Nixon, did a really good job.
Yeah, our friend Scott Wayne has a thing in chat that he bought the audio book, so he's you know, you're not going to fool him on the ending. You spent 10 years on this. Do you have another project in the works, or what? Or are you going to sit back for a little bit?
I'm just going to rest on my laurels. Well, I've got two little projects, age 4 and age 7, just in the next room. So that keeps me pretty busy. And there's a global pandemic to contend with. So progress is slow. But yes, I'm at work on a new book. And it's the true story of a 25-year-old free Black woman named Elizabeth Jennings, who lived in New York in the 1850s, and who was, quite simply, Rosa Parks 100 years before Rosa Parks, a woman who tries to force the desegregation of this segregated mass transit system in New York on the eve of the Civil War, and achieves considerable successes and sparks a national movement across the North. So I'm going to try to write her story to shine a light on segregation and desegregation and civil rights and civil disobedience in the Civil War.
Well, thank you very much for doing this tonight. This has been fabulous, and I'm going to let you go back to being a really good dad and have been taking care of those other 2 projects that you've been working on. I greatly appreciate the time. This has been gripping, and I really appreciate the fact that you put this together. So thank you for taking 10 years of your life to write this book.
It's been my honor. And of course, my email address is up on the screen if people want to ask me a question or follow up in any way at all. You can also just Google my name, Richard Bell, Maryland, which is where I teach, and you'll find me very quickly. Mark, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thanks so much to all of you. And I will say good night. Get vaccinated. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Bell. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay safe.